Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, our own Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Well, thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the last day of November in the year 2016. Today is November 30th. It is a Wednesday, and it is a pleasure to be with you once again live here on the Virtual Center, courtesy of the Head On Radio Network. And I appreciate, again, your continued support of this network, because it's only through the auspices of this network that we can even think about continuing a program like this. I want to begin by giving you some specific information that we do every day about phone numbers and that kind of thing. And again, we spent quite a bit of time in yesterday's program talking about this, about the issue of the phone and the conversation and all the rest of it. We had a call. Horst was kind enough to share his thoughts with us live yesterday on the program, if you were with us. And I'll kind of touch base and try to touch on a few of the points that were made yesterday, because I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation for a while. So we can think about it. I've got a couple of things that I wanted to add to what we had yesterday, and that'll give people an opportunity. After today, of course, we won't be on again until next Monday. So that'll give people an opportunity to spend I don't mean that you're going to spend full time on this by any stretch, but that over the course of the next 3 or 4 days, if this occurs to you, you can give it a little bit of thought, and then maybe the first of next week, kind of share your thinking or your conclusions with us here on the Virtual Center. Our phone number for direct contact, which will get you on the air, is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to share your thoughts with an email, then by all means I encourage you to do that. I'll do everything that I can to at least acknowledge receipt of your email. And more importantly, I'll do the very best I can to transmit your thoughts and your thinking to our listeners if you've made the decision to not do that yourself. If you put it in an email, I'll do the very best I can to get it on the air for you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And then finally, there is our Facebook page. We've had it now for probably about well over 6 months. I would guess probably closer to 8 or 9 months. And I think it's been tremendously successful. I'll be very honest with you as we talk about, discuss, and contemplate a few format changes in the program, as our program yesterday kind of indicated. It seems to me that we can probably make better use of Facebook as an example. One of the things I suggested yesterday during discussion, for example, when Horst was with us, is that we could better make use of our Facebook page by posting documents that we would be using on the program ahead of time, which would give people an opportunity to get a look at them before the program ran, before we came on the air, or even better, give people immediate access to the document in question so that they could bring it up on their computer and actually have it available as we discussed it. That way, the quotes would mean more. If I was reading a particular passage from a document, it seems to me that the combination of hearing it and seeing it in print at the same time would do a lot to make the significance and the substance of the particular paragraph in question even more defined, more prominent, if you will. It really would enhance the quality of what we're doing here. That reminds me of something that I hadn't thought of for a long time. I do believe that I mentioned this once before here on the Virtual Center, but it was a while ago. So let me mention it again. When I first went into teaching college, it wasn't the very beginning, but this would have been in the late 1970s, 78, 79. I was teaching community college in Richmond, Virginia, and we had the advantage of having grant money available that we could use to hire students. And I had a couple of students, and now this was before audiobooks, this was before CDs and all of this. In fact, what was prominent then, and some of you will remember this because it dates us a little bit, were cassette players and eight-track tapes, but specifically cassette players. And those were the instrument of the moment when during this period that I'm talking about. And I had a couple of students who I knew from class to be good readers. And what I asked them to do was record an audio version of our history textbook. And so what they would do for pay was that they would sit in during their work study hours, a couple of afternoons a week or something like that, and record a particular chapter or a section of the chapter from the textbook. And then what we would do would be to appropriately label the cassettes. In a sense, what we ended up with was an audio version of the textbook. And the reason for that is that I had read some research studies which indicated that a combination of hearing and seeing simultaneously the same copy, the same text, really went a long way toward implanting that text and helping students who had difficulty reading, and more especially had difficulty with reading comprehension, grasp the substance of what they were reading. And it seemed to me to make perfect sense. So basically what I did then was to get students to record an audio version of the textbook. And then I would have students who needed assistance in reading and reading comprehension to take a particular chapter in audio and run it at the same time they were reading the text out of the textbook. And the conclusion, my sense was that this would improve their comprehension, because there's something about hearing the words and not just seeing them on a printed page that for people who have difficulty reading seems to improve reading skills and reading comprehension. And I really do believe it worked. I didn't have any substantive way to demonstrate the effectiveness of this. I just assumed it was effective, and the results were qualitative. It seemed to me that the students who did this and took it seriously benefited from it. So, that's kind of what I'm talking about. I'm not suggesting that the people who listen to this program have reading comprehension issues. I'm just suggesting that it's much easier to hear and see a version of a particular document or passage of a document at the same time. It really does much more to implant the substance of the text and makes comprehension easier. I think one of the things I have learned over the years in teaching, and I think most of you would probably agree with this, is that even students who have difficulty reading, who don't read that well, can understand something when they hear it. If it's read well, if the pronunciation is clear, if the punctuation is emphasized so that the commas and the periods and the quotations are highlighted, then when people hear it and hear the quotes from the pen or the mouth of particular people involved in history, when they hear this and see it, they can understand it and react to it. So one of the major errors I believe that we've made in our approach to education for a long time was to assume that cognitive learning, was the result of good reading. And consequently, what we concluded from that is that only good readers could be educated. In a sense, what that means is that those people who had difficulty reading were oftentimes excluded from meaningful learning opportunities because they couldn't meet muster because they didn't read well enough. Fact of the matter is, even for those who did have difficulty reading and comprehending what they were reading from the printed page, many of these same people could understand it and react appropriately when they heard it, when it was in audio, when it was verbal, rather than just in print. So my feeling was that the combination of those two things would improve reading. That by hearing it and seeing the words in the text at the same time, that one's overall ability to draw meaning from the printed word would improve. That was the basis of this little experiment that I tried, and I do believe that it worked. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here, in a way. Although I'm not implying that anybody has reading comprehension problems or anything like that. I'm guessing that there are a lot of people who do. I know a lot of people who we would obviously label as good readers who have issues related to comprehension. Comprehension is very difficult. And it's much easier when all your mental faculties are focused on the text. But sometimes there are so many things that interfere with our concentration, ability to communicate, to concentrate, that we lose our train of thought, so to speak, and we have to go back and reread. And I've talked to students who have told me about reading and rereading and rereading and rereading, and finally they just give up. And so this is a very difficult skill. And for the most part, we've pretty well built our conclusions about educational potential, the potential of individual students to be educated, on how well they read. There's some basis for that, obviously, but I would suggest it's not that clear, it's not that definitive and black and white, because the fact of the matter is, many people who can hear a concept can evaluate, can analyze that concept in their mind, and can react to it substantively and appropriately. So, I really do believe that what we've done is kind of put the cart before the horse in the way we deal with reading and its link to education. We use the ability to read as a filter in order to determine what individuals are able to learn and what they are not capable of learning. I don't believe that that's proper. I don't believe that that's accurate. I think that research would indicate that that logic is faulty. I've always believed the opposite. And now we're seeing some research into reading and comprehension skills which reinforce this. And that is the idea that improved reading skills come from reading. That rather than using one's ability to read as a barometer in order to determine what they're capable of learning and what they're not, it seems to me we ought to turn that around totally. What we ought to say is, once basic learning skills are in place, then the way those skills are improved is by reading. And rather than denying people access to substantive material to read and to think about and to comprehend, the best things to do would be to immerse people who can read at a basic level in progressively higher order text, with the idea that their ability to comprehend and their ability to read better will improve with this kind of exposure. In other words, the pursuit of knowledge, learning itself, I believe, is the greatest motivator, the greatest stimulator to good reading. The reason that people become good reading is because there's a payoff to it. There's value to it. They learn from it. And they recognize the better I can read, the more I can know and understand. There's no better motivator than that. And so I think that we've been in error. We have locked numbers of qualified people from a positive educational experience because they've experienced difficulties, early difficulties in reading and reading comprehension. I think basically we've made a mistake, and I think those folks have continually paid for those mistakes. And I think we can. So in a sense, then what I feel is that, and this gets back to our conversation yesterday, that a shorter program would give us more flexibility and more opportunities to experiment with the technology and better utilize some of the resources we already have at hand, plus make those new resources that we don't even totally know about yet accessible to us as they come into play. So, in that sense, I think it's true. I mentioned that I had additional information that I wanted to share on this particular conversation that we had yesterday. If you remember, a major contribution that Horst made during his call was the fact that our very time frame, 1 to 3 in the afternoons, for example, is really a difficult time. It's not the time when you can expect to get maximum audience. People are working. They can't listen. They have to listen later on podcast. And the reality is, as Horst pointed out, that's where most of our listeners access the program, is on podcast after the fact. They're not out there live when the program is broadcast live. So therefore, they can't call in. They can't react. And as Horst said, that's a problem, because obviously it's not like you can change the time of the program and triple or quadruple the size of your live listening audience. You can't do that. And that's because there are so many programs out there that already have these listeners in tow, so to speak. It's not like you're coming out there with something that's so novel, so revolutionary in its implications, that people are going to leave the program that they're currently tune into in order to move to this new one. So that presents a problem. And I think part of the solution to that problem is the shorter program, because you can present and record in ways where you can run a program a couple of times, 2 or 3 times over the course of a 24-hour period, or over the weekend a couple of times, or something like that. And you can maximize the numbers of people who are exposed to this particular information or this particular analysis, or whatever it might be. I was in conversation with a close friend this morning on the phone. And he shared with me well, I was telling him what we were talking about yesterday about reducing the program to an hour. And he was all for it. And his reasoning is what I wanted to share with you. He reminded me of a study that was done in the early 70s at the University of Michigan. I am familiar with this study. I hadn't thought about it for years, and I didn't really relate it to this particular issue, but he did. And he pointed out that in the early 70s, the University of Michigan School of Business was conducting research in order to try to get an accurate read on people's receptiveness to learning. As businesses were pouring money into training, into on-site management training and job-related training, skills-based training, employers were very, very interested in how to schedule these things. In other words, I think all of us agree that you can't schedule a learning experience that goes on for a full 8-hour day, or even one that goes on for 4 hours, because the human attention span won't continue to absorb new information for that long a period. And so what this research at the University of Michigan was about was trying to find out exactly what the maximum times were when students were most receptive to new information, when learning was at its peak. And what this research revealed, was that there really is a 60-minute, a 1-hour maximum limit to people's ability to learn new materials or new concepts. That maximum learning occurs within the first 30 minutes, if you will. And learning will continue, although not at the same rate, for another 30 minutes. But that once you get beyond 60 minutes, once you get beyond an hour, then learning begins to deteriorate. That actually, the more over an hour the class goes, or the learning experience goes, people actually begin to unlearn some of the things that they learned earlier. In other words, there's a maximum amount of new information that human beings can absorb, can deal with, can cognitively react to. And once that maximum amount is reached, then the learning curve begins to shift from forward to backward, and actually people begin to unlearn. So the conclusion of this study was that learning opportunities ought not to extend much beyond an hour, because that's the most you can expect. People's capacity to retain information won't extend much beyond that time. My friend's comment was that when public K through 12 schools were contemplating going on block scheduling, extending regular class periods from 50 minutes or from an hour to an hour and a half to 90 minutes. A lot of people who were opposed to block scheduling were opposed because of this research. And their argument was that when you get into K through 12, when you get down into the junior high school and high school level, you're really asking for trouble when you extend the class too long, because you're going to have behavioral problems with some of these youngsters who can't be expected to sit and continue to absorb for that long a period. And sure enough, many schools did go on the 90-minute block scheduling, and now they're shredding it. They're abandoning it because they have learned the hard way that indeed it doesn't work. And they're going back to the shorter classes because the shorter classes maximize learning potential. This kind of research raises all sorts of questions about the school day, about the way that you structure a student's experiences from class to class through a typical day in school, that you've got to basically break these classes up, for example. One of the things that researchers have learned, for example, as an example, in looking at the Finnish schools, because the schools in Finland are in so many ways at the top of the pile when it comes to quality education in public education. And whereas many schools here have abolished gym, have abolished physical exercise or health education in order to fit in something much more substantive during that period, the Finnish schools have built in and continue to include regular physical exercise through the learning day. And the basic argument for that is that it regenerates learning potential. It really does break up the school day, the learning experience, in such a way that it regenerates learning and makes classes that follow physical education a lot more beneficial and a lot more rewarding than they would be without it. And the fact of the matter is, because for so long we've believed, so arrogantly, I guess, that we are the gold standard in terms of the way we educate our young, that we've tended to dismiss a lot of this research. And we just kind of go ahead and do what we believe best suits us. And oftentimes we learn the hard way. And that's what I'm saying. Maybe our 2-hour programs are pushing people's ability to retain. Some of this information is extremely deep, extremely complex, and extremely hard to absorb. And to provide 2 hours of it sometimes is a little bit unfair. So that, in a sense, then might speak to the need to do some readjustment, reconfiguring of the way we schedule our programs and the way we go about our business here at the Virtual Center. What I can tell you, and Agnes and I talked about this during our chat session before our program today began, what I can tell you is that she and Bob and I will continue these conversations. We'll meet. Bob and I have been talking for a couple of weeks about getting together over lunch, over a sandwich and a beer, and talking about some of these things. And that we'll do it, and we'll kind of keep all of you in touch. We'll let you know what we're doing. Because the last thing we want to do is structure or organize our programs in ways which may seem beneficial to us, but don't maximize the potential of what the material, what the program is about. The only way to evaluate the effectiveness of the program is by looking at it from your perspective, not ours. And that's what we continually need to do. And then there's something much more practical. Now I'm going to contradict what I just said. When I mentioned to my wife that we were engaged in conversation about reducing the number of the time of the program back to an hour and extending it to 5 days a week, her reaction is, "Oh my God, that's a 60-hour-a-week commitment. You can't do that." And she's right, I can't. Even if I could one time, I can't anymore. So all of these things are going to have to go into the equation, into the pot, so to speak, and we're going to have to make some scheduling decisions in the next several weeks, but we'll do that, and hopefully we'll do it in ways which will benefit and not work contrary to the intent, to the mission of the Virtual Center and the intent of the programs in the first place. So we'll keep you posted, but all I want you to know is that that the opportunity is always there for additional input. So if in the course of thinking about these things over the next several days, if something occurs to you that you think we would benefit from knowing, then by all means find a way to get it to us, whether it's on the phone, whether it's in an email, whether it's on Facebook, however you do it. Please don't let us continue without your wisdom, without things that have occurred to you that we ought to know in making these kinds of decisions. Because I think they are. I think they really are important. And I think the program is important. And I think the one thing we want to make sure of is that the way we present the programs maximizes the potential and the effectiveness of those programs. There's a phone ringing in the background. It's my home phone. Don't worry about it. I'll just let it ring. It has an answering machine, and I'll be able to call back later if it's important. With that, we've basically gone through the first 30 minutes of our program, and that's fine. That I think that issue is extremely important, and I wanted to share some of those things with you. And I wanted to touch on a number of other issues that we have in the hopper, so to speak, that I'd like to deal with today. The first issue that I'd like to address in this first hour, maybe the bulk of our second half hour within our first hour in the next 25 minutes or so, I'd like to deal with the emoluments clause because it's getting a lot of attention. It continues to get attention. In fact, let me begin with the latest. This morning, and when I say this morning, when you're talking about Donald Trump and his Twitter account, mornings begin awfully early. This, the pattern, of course, is that by the time these news networks get up and begin to prepare their broadcast day, Donald Trump has been busy hours before that. And so the fact of the matter is when they get up to one or more tweets that Donald Trump has made on some of the most sensitive and particular and significant issues that the nation faces. Especially, I'm going through some materials here just to make sure that I don't overlook important information. The issue that I really wanted to share with you at the beginning was an issue related to Donald Trump's tweets, his Twitter account. This appeared in yesterday's, I believe, Washington Post. And it could be New York Times, I'm not really sure. It's one or the other. But the title of this particular piece is, "If Donald Trump Tweets, Is It News? A Quandary for the News Media." And basically what this article addresses is the media's difficulty of dealing with Donald Trump's use of social media, his use of Twitter, his ongoing frequent use of Twitter, and his seeming intention to continue to use it even after he's sworn in as President of the United States. Donald Trump uses Twitter to throw out trial balloons, we've talked about this numerous times, on some of the most sensitive and volatile issues that our nation is wrestling with on a day-to-day basis. Just yesterday, for example, and I think we mentioned this on yesterday's program, he basically raised the issue of flag burning. Basically said that those people who desecrate the flag of this country should do jail time, perhaps be deported. A number of people and media outlets reacted to that particular tweet by pointing out that on 2 occasions, the Supreme Court has ruled on flag burning, and in both of them has reinforced the conclusion that flag burning is a form of political speech. And as such, it is protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution. If you want to do something about flag burning, you're going to have to change the First Amendment, is the conclusion. And one of the most interesting things about this particular issue before the Supreme Court is that the hero of Donald Trump and other conservatives, deceased Justice Antonin Scalia, himself found in favor of flag burning as political speech. And he made the comment in the last decision. It was a Texas decision. The state of Texas had passed legislation making it illegal to burn the flag. And that case came before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled the state and argued that that particular law was a violation of the First Amendment because flag burning was a form of political speech. Antonin Scalia was in the majority in that decision. And his basic argument is that he personally would like to do something to these people who desecrate the flag. He made reference to the fact that they were unshaven hippies and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, he said in his concurring opinion, I'd like to do something about it, but in order to do it, I'd have to be king. And I'm not a king. And in this society, to do anything to tamper with speech is a violation of the First Amendment, and therefore we can't do it. So the fact of the matter is, Donald Trump is actively taking a political position and presenting it to the media between his election and his taking office, which blatantly contradicts decisions the Supreme Court of the United States has already reached. So the question is, how does the media deal with that? Should it be ignored? One of the statements in this particular article that I'm referring to, and this is a statement from Matthew Purdy, who's a deputy managing editor at the New York Times. And Purdy makes the comment, quote, clearly his tweets are a window into policy decisions or his state of mind, he says. Just because he tweets doesn't make it news. But just because he tweets doesn't make it frivolous either. Conclusion, what Purdy is saying is the only way that the media can deal substantively with Donald Trump's tweets is to deal with them based on the substance of each individual tweet. The mere fact that it's a tweet doesn't mean that the media can afford to blow it off. But on the other hand, the fact that it's a tweet from the President of the United States doesn't mean either that it's front page news and it needs to be given that kind of status. So I think both of those positions are realistic. Chris Wallace, the prominent host on Fox News, Chris Wallace makes the point and says, quote, anything that a president would say, even if it's libelous or scandalous, it's the president talking, and I think you report it, Chris Wallace says. Under any definition, it's news, whether it's sensible or not, factual or not, productive or not. And then he mentioned that he used to report one-line comments from Ronald Reagan when Ronald Reagan was getting on board the helicopter and going to Camp David on weekends. That oftentimes when Ronald Reagan was boarding the presidential helicopter, he would make a statement about some issue. Chris Wallace said, I covered him, and I made sure that those comments he made getting on the helicopter made it into the news because they're coming from the President of the United States. The fact that these are on Twitter doesn't make them any less significant than that. The President is saying them, and they need to be given credibility for that. Now, based on what they say, they can be ignored, they can be criticized, they can be praised, whatever they warrant. But you make that decision on the content, on the substance of the tweets, not in fact that they are tweets. Stephen Ginsburg, for the Washington Post, politics editor for the Washington Post, addresses the same issue. He says, my view, frankly, is that everybody is getting way too caught up with the fact that he's tweeting. He said, even if Mr. Trump shouts something on a street corner, I think it's worth taking up on its own merits, unquote. Todd Gitlin, and many of you may remember the name Todd Gitlin, he was a political activist in the 1980s in the anti-war movement. He makes the comment and says, these pronouncements on Twitter are the only available evidence of what this man is thinking or wants us to think he's thinking. And we've got to deal with them on that basis, he says. Let me read you this particular extended comments from Carrie Brown, who's editor at Politico. Carrie Brown says, we have to treat it as one piece of a bigger reporting puzzle that it's up to us to put together. Fundamentally, she said, the thoughts of the president-elect are newsworthy. We've got to begin with that. As long as journalists also provide readers with the right context, like whether a proposal is feasible, legal, or whether it's correct or a baseless claim. This is the way he's communicating with millions upon millions of people. And as journalists, we can't ignore that. Katrina Van Heuvel, who's the editor of The Nation, disagrees. And of course, we need to understand that Christina Vanden Heuvel is a major critic of Donald Trump, as is The Nation. Media would be wise to stop hyper coverage of Trump's tweets, she said. They distract, distort, and debase. Historian Fred Kaplan says the same thing. It's time to ignore his tweets. I'm almost beginning to believe the theory, he says, that Trump's tweets are subterfuge in order to distract us from real scandals. It's time to ignore the tweets and focus on the news. So I think we can all begin to see the significance of what we're talking about. This is the president-elect speaking on issues. Oftentimes in the past, presidents and president-elects when they have made statements, by definition, they're usually very vague statements. They're usually designed to lay the groundwork for some follow-up statement or speech that is to come. They're generally intended to be provocative, to get attention, to put people on notice that something important is going to happen. What makes Donald Trump's tweets different than that is that he's not making vague statements about principles. He's making substantive comments about real issues. He's saying that, for example, the comment about flag burning. Basically, he's taken a position which runs contrary to the rulings of the Supreme Court of the United States. Can we just continue to shrug our shoulders at that and say it really doesn't matter or it's really not important? What I wanted to close this particular issue with is a statement by Hope Hicks, who is a spokesman for Donald Trump. And basically, the issue at hand is his tweets. And this is her statement. President-elect Trump has amassed an incredible social media following, one he used very effectively throughout the campaign to communicate his message. He intends to continue utilizing this modern form of communication while taking into account his new role and responsibilities may call for modified usage, unquote. Basically, then, the issue is he is fully aware of the impact that Twitter is having on his ability to communicate with millions and millions of Americans. He recognized its value during the campaign. As we mentioned the other day, maybe yesterday, here at the Virtual Center, he made a very specific point of telling Leslie Stahl in that 60 Minutes interview a week ago Sunday that social media got him elected. He's fully aware of the power, the potential power that this medium gives him. He's not about to give it up. We're going to have to deal with it. And then finally, and this is one issue that actually came up during my chat session with Agnes prior to the time we went on the air today, and I have to thank her for this. In fact, let me make another point. This is more proof positive that there's something about dialogue, about a real exchange, conversation, that enhances learning. Because this is something that I hadn't thought of, and I do believe it's something that she hadn't thought of either until we were engaged in this conversation. And then both of us realized it at approximately the same time. And it's important. So let me begin with the information itself. Hope Hicks, the spokesman for Donald Trump that we just quoted, Hope Hicks made the comment that Donald Trump's Twitter account has 16.3 million followers. 16.3 million. The Twitter account assigned to the President of the United States, which is @POTUS, had 12.3 million followers. Donald Trump's private email, a Twitter account, has 4 million more citizens, people in the network than the official Twitter account of the President of the United States. So, given the fact that he's in touch with 4 million more people, her suggestion is he's not about to give up his private Twitter account and go to the official President of the United States Twitter account. When I made that point to Agnes during our chat session earlier today, she made the point that this raises very similar issues to Hillary Clinton's private email server. The difference being that we're talking about a hell of a lot more people involved in these Twitter accounts than we were talking about on a private email server. At which point I responded, the potential of this issue, because of the numbers of people involved and the potential power implied in this particular issue, may mean that this particular issue about Donald Trump's Twitter account might end up being much more significant politically than all the controversy and all the hype we heard throughout the campaign about Hillary Clinton's private email server. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that Republican spokesmen were all over Hillary Clinton for this private server, when in fact Donald Trump's Twitter account in the long term might be a lot more significant. Because, let's face it, there's no way to censor or to screen what Donald Trump puts on Twitter. In fact, one of the things we know from his behavior so far is that some of the stuff that Donald Trump puts on Twitter has not been appropriate. This is where he's gone after the Miss America, if you remember, that Hillary Clinton raised in one of the presidential debates when he was the judge of the Miss America contest and criticized one of the candidates, one of the contestants, because she had gained so much weight. This is the media that he used to go after Mr. Khan, the father of the dead soldier that got so much attention during the campaign. Donald Trump opens up sores, sensitive issues with Twitter. The mere fact that it's 140 characters and it's instantaneous communication means that the only way to filter what goes on his Twitter account is when he chooses to run the things he intends to say by advisors, which at 3 and 4 in the morning he's not likely to do. So the fact of the matter is, as President-elect Trump, and soon to be President Trump, becomes more and more aware of information on some of these private briefings about America's international commitments and obligations, about issues related to military preparedness, about nuclear weapons, about relations with Russia, relations with the Middle East, relations with Israel, relations with China, relations with Mexico, and the potential building of the infamous wall, and all of these other things that relate to international politics and international finance. His access to Twitter, it seems to me, is a cocked shotgun. There's no way to know when it's not going to go off, when he's not going to put something on Twitter that never should have been on there. Because we all know once you say it, you can't unsay it. Once it's out there, it's out there. I would suggest to you that the major critics of Hillary Clinton in the whole issue surrounding her private email server almost places an obligation on them to take steps to do something about their own president. Because potentially the future security of the nation could rely on what he puts or doesn't put on Twitter. I would suggest to you that this issue about the continued use of his private Twitter account ought not to be his to make. I think somebody has got to make this decision for him, because he doesn't have the perspective to make, I don't believe, to make this kind of decision. He is going to be privy to the kinds of information that this kind of instantaneous access to 16.3 million people, and potentially a hell of a lot more once he's sworn in as president. Because let's face it, who would not want to be on the Twitter account of the President of the United States? Who would not want to be the regular recipient of daily comments on the issues of the day from the top, from the big office? I want to be on that account. I want to know that when the President of the United States communicates with millions of Americans, I want to make sure that I'm one of them. I can tell you that there are people throughout the world whose intentions aren't nearly as pure or as innocent as mine, who want to be on them as well. And what that means is, for the national security itself, he can't be permitted to continue to use Twitter. One must assume that the official Twitter account of the President of the United States is screened, is filtered. That everything that goes on that Twitter account is approved. We can't say that about his private account. Therefore, it seems to me that the forces that be have to find a way to shut down that private account. In our next hour, we're going to be talking about Donald Trump's private business affairs and the whole issue of conflict of interest, specifically relating to the emoluments cause. I would suggest to you that conflict of interest between his role as President of the United States and his status as head honcho for a number of these huge businesses, while dangerous to the nation, is not nearly as serious as the potential of a private Twitter account with unlimited numbers of people on the receiving end. I think that the Democrats in Congress are passing up a huge issue here, unless, in the interests of the security of this nation, they don't make an issue, a public issue of this. and especially point out the hypocrisy of this particular issue in the face of what Hillary Clinton went through over her private email account. As Bernie Sanders said in one of the first primary debates of the Democratic campaign, the American people are sick and tired of your damn emails. I'm not sure that the American people are sick and tired of Donald Trump's damn Twitter messages. Damn tweets is the appropriate word. But I think somebody better flag them and do it soon. With that, we have completed the first hour of our program today here at the Virtual Center. It is 2 p.m. in the East. It is exactly the top of the hour. We are going to pause and take our 5-minute break as we usually do on our full 2-hour broadcasts. Then we'll be back with our second hour. And the first issue that I'd like to deal with in our second hour is the Emoluments Clause and the whole issue of conflict of interest. Then I'd like to share with you an article that came across my computer this morning on the nature of the election results and the allegation that prominent Democrats dismissed or refused to listen to the pleas and the frustration and the anger being expressed by white, middle class, and working class Americans in rural America. It's a piece that came across on Alternet this morning. I think it's extremely relevant. I'd like, before we leave for this week's programs, I'd like to make sure that everybody has access to it. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to take a short break, then we'll be back with our second hour. I hope you'll stay with us. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes. I didn't have my microphone on. I was talking away here and nobody was hearing me but me. Anyway, welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Wednesday. Today is the final day, the 30th day of November in the year 2016. It is a pleasure to be with you here in our second hour. I was going to say, but I don't want this to sound facetious or sarcastic, as it was in our first hour, but I mean that. It is always a pleasure to be here at the Virtual Center and to share these thoughts and these ideas with you, our listening audience. I do invite you to take advantage of the opportunities made available to you to participate even more actively in the program by sharing your thoughts with our other listeners as well as with me. For that purpose, we have a phone number which will get you directly on the air. That number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with us that way directly, is waobrien906 at gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. And then finally, I call your attention to our Facebook page. I did put a posting on the Facebook page this morning. It was really a link to the article that I'm going to be dealing with later in this second hour, on an article that appeared on Facebook today. It is from Alternet, and I shared it on my Facebook page with my friends because I believe it's a significant piece. It's quite long. It takes a while to read, but it's pretty insightful. And let me say, just as an aside, that I shared it with my wife this morning and told her about how good I thought it was. And even though she's I think temporarily, because I don't think she can continue this for too long. But so far, she's hanging on since the election. She doesn't want to deal with anything political after the elections. I think she's burned out. I don't know how long that'll last, as I say, but at least now it's still active. Because her reaction was, if this is an article about Donald Trump, I don't want to read it. And I said, no, it's not so much about Donald Trump. It's about some of the people who supported Donald Trump. It's pretty long, but I think you'd really learn from it and appreciate it. So she sat here and read it on her computer and agreed. 3 times she made the comment to me, this guy absolutely nails it. This is perfect. He's got it. And she grew up in southern West Virginia. She's going many generations back, a real West Virginian. She actually serves on the board of one of the largest families here in the entire region on the family gathering that they have every August here in West Virginia. She's a Lilly. And she's on the board for the Lilly Reunion, which a couple of years ago made the record books as the largest family reunion on record, where they had, I don't know, several 100,000 people attend their reunion. And of course, part of the reason that it gets such large attention is it's not only people who are Lillys, but people who marry into the Lillys are counted amongst them. And so for the last couple of years, I've gone to the Lilly Reunion as well, and I've seen friends there. And they said to me, I didn't know you were Lilly. And I said, oh, I'm not. I married a Lilly. And one of my best friends said, well, you could have done a lot worse. So anyway, as a Lilly, I think my wife's reaction to this particular article is extremely poignant and extremely important. So I'm kind of using this as a lead-in and hope that you'll stay with us and that you'll perhaps agree that this is an article that would be well worth your time reading. But the first issue I'd like to deal with is one that we've kind of had on the front burner for a week now, and it's the issue of the emoluments clause and conflict of interest. And let me begin with what probably, I think, since we've gone on the air, I don't know this for sure, but as of this morning, as of about an hour before we went on the air, this was the latest news on this particular issue coming from Donald Trump himself. Trump announced in a tweet early this morning that on the 15th of December, a couple of weeks from now, he would be holding a press conference, not so much a press conference, but that he would be calling the media in for what he said was going to be a major announcement. And that announcement, he was going to be there with his children. And this announcement was going to be that he was going to address and make provision for the potential of conflict of interest between his businesses and his role as President of the United States. So in a sense, what I can say at the outset of this issue is that as of now, Trump himself has bought into the idea of the concerns about potential conflict of interest. And he has committed to doing something about it. Now, what he does is another issue, of course. The mere fact that he passes control of his businesses on to his daughter and her husband won't really suffice. In order to really draw the line on the issue of conflict of interest, he would have to step down as the owner of these businesses. The mere fact that he allows the businesses to be managed by his children is not separation enough to relieve anxieties about conflict of interest. So there's more to this that we're going to have to watch for in coming days. But at least as of this morning, the president on Twitter, the president-elect on Twitter, made clear that he is aware of the conflict of interest potential that his swearing in would pose in light of his international business interests, and that he commits to doing something about that in order to relieve anxieties about the matter and to deal with it. What he does, we're going to have to wait and see. So this gets back to the very issue of conflict of interest itself. And more specifically, conflict of interest when it comes to the President of the United States. The fact of the matter is, the so-called Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, which is in Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 8. It's at almost the very end of Article 1 of the Constitution, says the following. This is Paragraph 8. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them, under the United States, shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state, unquote. Let me read that again. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state, unquote. Before we talk about that clause, which for lack of a better term is usually referred to as the Emoluments Clause, let me say a couple of things about it just in terms of the language itself. Just in terms of the clause. Not talking about any article or what different attorneys have said or legal experts have said about this particular issue. Let's just look at the language. The first thing, it seems to me, that jumps out is that it doesn't absolutely 100% forbid presents, emoluments, offices, or titles coming from any king, prince, or foreign state. It seems to. The language is pretty definitive. It includes words like any kind whatever. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. No person holding an office of trust or profit shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present emolument, office, etc. The use of the word knows, of any kind whatever, would seem to be definitive, would seem to suggest that there are no exceptions to this. But the fact of the matter is there is an exception. And the exception is the consent of the Congress. What this clause says is that Congress can waive the clause, so that if a person of profit or trust is in line for a present or an emolument or an office or a title from a king, prince, a foreign state, which would violate this particular part of the Constitution, Congress has the authority to waive it. That's the first thing I think we need to recognize, that it is not definitive and that Congress has the opportunity, the legal constitutional right, to waive this particular clause in a particular circumstance. The second thing to keep in mind by looking at the language of this particular clause is that there's no specific mention of the president or vice president in it. But on the other hand, there's no specific mention of any other office holder either. So the question as to whether this applies to the president or not is impossible to determine from the language alone. When it said, no person holding any office of profit or trust, that obviously would include the president and the vice president, it seems to me. So on reading the language of the Emoluments Clause, one would say coming out of the gate that it involves or it applies to the President of the United States. But the fact of the matter is, there are many people who claim that it does not. One of the reasons that people point to say that it does not apply to the president is the fact that this Emoluments Clause is in Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States. Article 1 applies to the legislative branch of government, to Congress. Article 2 applies to the president. Consequently, if this particular clause was intended by the founders to apply to the president, then shouldn't it have been in Article 2 as well as in Article 1? Since it isn't, many conclude that it doesn't apply to the president. But there's one other factor that seems to play into all of this. And that relates to the issue that Congress can waive it. Since Congress has the right to waive it, then it seems to me logical to conclude that Congress has the right at any time it chooses to have it apply to the president or not apply to the president. That this is a decision not to be reached by those who would interpret the Constitution. This is a decision that only Congress has the constitutional authority to make or determine. And if Congress makes the decision that it doesn't apply to the president, that is totally consistent with the Constitution of the United States. So consequently, that would be valid. And the fact of the matter is That is indeed exactly what happened. Little sneeze break there, I apologize. In an interview on CNN with Jake Tapper on November 13th, which was 5 days after the election, Rudy Giuliani, remember him? Rudy Giuliani made the comment to Jake Tapper as follows. Well, first of all, you realize that those laws don't apply to the president, right? So the president doesn't have to have a blind trust. For some reason, when the law was written, the president was exempt. Unquote. Rudy Giuliani. The fact of the matter is, Giuliani is sort of right here. Trump as president really doesn't have a legal obligation to detach himself from his businesses and financial interests. Title 18, Section 208 of the U.S. Code says so. It says that federal executive branch employees cannot participate in government matters in which they or their immediate family has a financial interest. Federal executive branch employees cannot participate in government matters in which they or their immediate family has a financial interest. This is what has led to the blind trusts and all the other provisions. But according to this treatment, the president and the vice president, although they are executive branch employees, are exempt. It appears, says Scott Army, general counsel at the Project on Government Oversight, it appears that presidents have mostly escaped the normal web of ethics and conflict of interest laws. It's been this way since 1974, when the Justice Department issued a letter saying that Title 18, Section 208 did not apply to the president. Congress expressly codified that exemption in 1989. In a 1974 letter, the Justice Department said, the legislative history of this conflict of interest provision indicated that it was never intended to apply to the president. Also, the Justice Department said placing conflict of interest laws on the president would constrain him in a potentially unconstitutional manner. As head of the executive branch, the president may not be able to, and arguably under the Constitution, it might not be possible to require the president to recuse himself from government decisions. Consequently, Congress, by law, based on a Justice Department decision in 1974, Congress passed legislation in 1989 specifically exempting the President of the United States from the Emoluments Clause. At least that's the way it looks. Last week, during the extensive 2-hour interview, I believe it was a 90-minute interview, that Donald Trump had with the executive board at the New York Times, this issue of conflict of interest came up. I wanted to share with you the text. As I mentioned in a previous program, I've read the text of that particular 90-minute meeting with the board, the executive board of the New York Times. And this is the way I'm going to read the text but I think the context we've got here, you know pretty well what we're looking for. So let's just look at what the text of the meeting tells us. Trump. Now, according to the law, see, I figured there's something where you put something in this massive trust. And there's also, nothing is written. In other words, in theory, I can be president of the United States and run my business 100%, sign checks on my business, which I am phasing out of very rapidly, you know. I sign checks. I'm the old-fashioned type. I like to sign checks so I know what is going on, as opposed to pressing a computer button, boom, thousands of checks are automatically sent. It tells me what's going on a little bit, and it tells contractors that I'm watching. But I'm phasing all that out now and handing this to Eric Trump and Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump for the most part, and some of my executives. So that's happening right now. But in theory, I could run my business perfectly and then run the country perfectly. And there's never been a case like this where somebody's had, like, if you look at other people's of wealth, they didn't have this kind of asset and this kind of wealth, frankly. It's just a different thing. But there is no, I assume that you'd have to set up some type of trust or whatever. And you know. And I was actually a little bit surprised to see it. So in theory, I don't have to do anything. But I would like to do something. I would like to try and formalize something because I don't care about my business. And then he goes on, talks about his golf courses and stuff. Trump goes on later on in the interview. As far as, you know, the potential conflict of interest, though, I mean, I know that from the standpoint, the law is totally on my side, meaning the president can't have a conflict of interest. That's been reported very widely. Despite that, I don't want there to be a conflict of interest anyway. And the laws, the president can't. And I understand why the president can't have a conflict of interest now, because everything a president does in some ways is like a conflict of interest. But I've built a very great company, and it's a big company, and it's all over the world. People are starting to see when they look at all these different jobs, like in India and other things, it's all good. But I have to say the partners come in. They're very successful people. They come in, they say, would it be possible to have a picture? Actually, my children are working on that job. So I can say to them, Arthur, I don't want to have a picture. Or I can take a picture. I mean, I think it's wonderful to take a picture. I'm fine with a picture. But if it were up to some people, I would never even ever see my daughter Ivanka again. That would be like you never seeing your son again. That wouldn't be good. That wouldn't be good. But I'd never, ever see my daughter Ivanka. Then he talks again about his real estate. My company, and of course he's talking about how the president, being president of the United States, is the most important thing to him. He said, my company is so unimportant to me relative to what I'm doing because I don't need money. I don't need anything. And by the way, I'm very underleveraged. I have a very small percentage of my money in debt. Very, very small percentage of my money in debt. In fact, banks have said, we'd like to loan you money. Would like to give you any amount of money. I've been there before. I've had it both ways when I've been over-leveraged. I've been under-leveraged, and especially as you get older, under-leveraged is better. Trump says later on, and I'll stop here, just a minute, because it's an important question. I don't care about my company. I mean, if a partner comes in from India or if a partner comes in from Canada, where we did a beautiful big building that just opened, and they want to take a picture and come into my office, my kids come in, and I originally made the deal with these people. I mean, what am I going to say? I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to take pictures. You have to, on a human basis, you take pictures. But I just want to say that I'm given the right thing to do something so important in terms of so many of the issues we discussed. My kids, it doesn't matter. My kids run it. They'll say I have a conflict because we just opened a beautiful hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. So every time somebody stays at that hotel, if they stay there because I'm president, I guess you could say it's a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of interest. But again, I'm not going to have to do anything with the hotel. And that may very well happen. I mean, it could be that occupancy is that hotel. Excuse me, this phone is driving me crazy. I don't have any idea who it is, so I'm not going to answer it.
Bill,
Yes.
do you want to take
Yes.
a second and just go ahead and get that in case it's
No.
important? Okay.
No, it's not important. Don't worry about it. Thank you, though.
Oh.
Thank you, Agnes.
You're welcome.
So anyway, the whole point of these quotations, apparently somebody didn't get the number the first time and called right back, so it seemed like a lot of ringing. I apologize for that, but it is not important. The final point that I'd like to make about this whole issue of conflict of interest in emoluments is that there is a second emoluments clause in the Constitution of the United States, and it is in Article 2, Section 4, relating specifically to the president and the vice president. The president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other crimes, other high crimes and misdemeanors. Article 2 of the Constitution, which relates directly to the executive branch, to the president, speaks to the issue of impeachment and removal from office for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That, in the mind of many people, is a form of the emoluments clause applying specifically to the President of the United States, especially since it's in Article 2, but especially because it specifically mentions the President and Vice President of the United States and all other civil officers of the United States. So the combination of these two clauses, these two emoluments clauses, would seem to me to make it pretty difficult to argue that the President of the United States is exempt from consideration under the emoluments clause. But again, this has been one of those clauses, one of those parts of the Constitution that really never surfaced. It's never become an issue before. And very honestly, one of the reasons it's not become an issue is because previous presidents have done everything they can do to prevent it. They have created blind trusts. They have separated themselves from their business interests. They have tried to do everything that they can do to make sure that they would never be accused of any kind of conflict of interest. So the fact of the matter is, it seems to me, that this is one of those clauses that only becomes an issue because of the people, or in this case, the person that we're talking about. We're dealing with an individual in Donald Trump who not only has worldwide business interests that probably exceed President-elects previously, but more important, we've got a president-elect who up until very recently hasn't really made it clear whether being president of the United States or running his companies was his priorities. If you remember, toward the end of the campaign, when he appointed Steve Bannon as his campaign advisor, there was serious question as to whether Trump even cared that much about winning. There was suggestion, we made it here at the Virtual Center, that there was serious thinking that Donald Trump's ultimate goal was to build a media empire to compete with Fox News. And that's why he hired Steve Bannon. At this time, all the polls were saying that he didn't have a chance of winning. And now we find out that in the inner circle of those around him, many people closest to him also didn't believe that he had much of a chance of winning. So the fact of the matter is, it's only now, with the interview at the New York Times last week, that Donald Trump has basically said that he wants to make sure that being president receives his full attention. And that in order to do that, he's going to turn the management of his businesses over to his children. But legal advisors suggest that that's not really enough to separate him from the application of the Emoluments Clause, that he's going to have to do more. But the fact of the matter is, conflict of interest, it seems to me, is really an important issue. And I just wanted to address that issue. My wife, God love her, just came in and took the phone out of the room, so I don't exactly know what's going on with all these calls. But that thing has been ringing and ringing and ringing, and it's never done that before. So anyway, but I do have call waiting, and I checked the number, and I didn't know who was on it, so there's no reason to take it, so I'm not going to worry about it. But that's the issue of conflict of interest of the Emoluments Clause. And I think it's really important that all of us watch, now that Donald Trump has scheduled a major announcement on separating his businesses from his role as president, potential role as president, on the 15th of December. It seems to me that all of us will have to be watching very closely to see exactly how he does that, how he creates separation or creates distance, if you will, between himself, his businesses, and his role as president. Let me say that on the 21st of November, which was a week ago, Adam Liptak wrote a piece in the New York Times on this particular issue about business dealings and constitutional conflict of interest. And the one thing I wanted to mention, I don't really have anything in this particular article that adds a whole lot to what we've already said, except that when he was president-elect, after the election of 2008, Barack Obama went to the Justice Department in order to address the issues of conflict of interest involving a foreign government. Specifically, Obama wanted to know whether accepting the Nobel Peace Prize would be for him a conflict of interest. And that raised the issue of the emoluments clause. David Barron, who was a Justice Department official and is now Federal Appeals Court judge in Boston, wrote a 13-page single-spaced answer to Obama's question. That's how constitutionally substantive this particular issue was with Obama. And in that 13-page decision, Barron said the following, that there are two things that are very clear on this issue. First, the emoluments clause surely applied to the president. And the Nobel Peace Prize, which includes a check for $1.4 million, was just the sort of thing that would be barred if it came from a foreign nation. In the end, however, Barron concluded that Obama could accept the Nobel Peace Prize because the committee that chose him for it was independent of the Norwegian government and that the prize itself was privately funded. In other words, because there was a separation between the board that picked him and the people who put up the money for the prize, because there was a separation from the Norwegian government, that meant that it did not violate the emoluments clause. But Barron's concluding opinion was that the emoluments clause does indeed apply to the President of the United States. So what we have are opinions on both sides of the aisle here. It seems to me that the pressure is on Donald Trump to resolve it before it becomes a constitutional crisis of sorts. And it sounds to me like he's aware of that and is intending to do something about it. We'll have to see what he does in order to draw conclusions on how effective his actions are. We don't have all that much time left in today's program. We've got, it seems to me, about 10 or 11 minutes left in our program, which isn't really that much time to deal with this issue in detail, but at least I can introduce it. What we'll do then is we'll pick up in our first program next week with this particular issue. This is the fourth different issue that we've dealt with in today's program. I think it's a particularly important one. Let me explain why. I ran for office, for statewide office, in the election that was just held on November 8th in a rural state, which is West Virginia, southern West Virginia. I can relate to the content of what's in this particular article. What I intend to do once we get off the air today is to post a link to this article on Facebook. I think it's already there. I think I did that this morning, but I just want to make sure. And if I didn't, I will, because I want all of our Facebook listeners and followers to have an opportunity to look at this article. Because what this article does is address the prominent conclusion after the election that the Democratic Party lost the election because they ignored or refused to take seriously the plight of poor, rural, working-class Americans. And that's the constituency that won the election, at least the Electoral College election, for Donald Trump. The conclusion of this article, which is very long, the last two sentences of this article say the following. The problem, the author says, isn't a lack of understanding by coastal elites. The problem is a lack of understanding of why rural Christian white America believes, votes, behaves the way it does by rural Christian white America. The theme of this article is that the Democratic Party didn't ignore the plight of rural white Christian fundamentalist America. But the fact of the matter is, this particular group that ended up voting for Donald Trump rejects out of hand anything that comes from outside its own bubble, so to speak. The use of the term bubble is the author's word. His argument is that anything that confronts rural America that smacks of change of any kind is rejected, not necessarily because of the substance of the change, but because it comes from outside. Because those who advocate this change are not members of the constituency itself. The only change that this group is willing to accept is change that comes from within it, from its own people, from within itself. It's change that is always minimal, that is always slow, and that only gradually is accepted. So the fact of the matter is, according to this article, there is a substantive difference or a substantive gap between what this group of people wants and what the Democratic Party was bringing in terms of message and information. And this group chose to reject all of it. So it isn't necessarily, this article argues, that the Democratic Party ignored the plight of rural America so much as rural America rejected the introduction of change proposed by the Democratic Party. What it went for instead was the point of view that promised to reject and thwart this change in order to preserve what traditionally existed there. This is the decision that these people made. As a candidate in rural America in the last election, I can attest to the fact that there's quite a bit of validity to this particular thesis. I was receiving advice throughout the campaign from good friends and colleagues who were telling me that I had to tone down my campaign, that I was taking positions and writing and speaking on issues which really contradicted and violated the very basis of what these people wanted and believed. That what I was doing was threatening the status quo in this region, and that these people would, out of hand, reject my candidacy because of that. I was confronted with a personal problem. And that is that I needed to be receptive to what they wanted, but I also needed to be cognizant of being true to myself. I could not advocate or not advocate positions on issues which I believed were necessary and positive. It seemed to me that I had obligations to myself and obligations to those who were closest to me to be myself and not try to pretend that I was anything else. I was running as a candidate who promised to do the very best I could do for those people that I would represent if I were elected. I felt that I had to be consistent with that. Good friends were telling me that my commitment to doing that was probably going to cost me the election. I lost. But the fact of the matter is, I don't believe I lost by a whole lot. I don't believe that I lost by such a margin that, in fact, it proved that they were right. I think I made inroads. I think the level of support that I got indicated that some of what I was saying was getting through. So in that sense, I have a reason to take issue with some of this particular article. But let me encourage you, in the intervening time between now and the next time we get together here at the Virtual Center. The title of this piece is, quote, "The Dark Rigidity of Fundamental Rural America, A View from the Inside." It is an extensive article based on the idea that Democrats fail to understand white working class fly over America. This author's argument is that indeed is not true. He calls it BS. He said the real problem isn't East Coast elites who don't understand or care about rural America. The real problem, he says, is rural America doesn't understand the causes of their own situations and fears, and they have shown no interest in finding out. They don't want to know why they feel the way they do, or why they are struggling, because they don't want to admit it is in large part because of choices that they've made and horrible things that they've allowed themselves to believe. In other words, he's putting the ball back in their court, if you will. On Facebook, now that I think about it, I know I posted this on Facebook this morning. Because in the comments I made, I said, if there's a negative to it, it smacks of the idea of blaming the victim. It kind of suggests that what the Democratic Party, or the author of this article in the name of the Democratic Party, is doing is washing his hands by saying, hey, we brought the message. If they didn't want to hear what we were saying, that's not our problem, it's their problem. So it almost smacks of blaming the victim. But the fact of the matter is, it's an important article. It includes a lot of very substantive concepts, ideas, and pieces of information. I think it's important enough that we devote time to it here at the Virtual Center. But as I've made very clear already, we don't have that kind of time left today. It is 58 minutes after the hour. I guess it's time for us to sign off at the end of another broadcast week here at the Virtual Center. Let me thank you for being with us. Let me encourage you and thank you for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network, and urge you to continue doing that, because that's the only way that programs like the Virtual Center will stay on the air. I hope that you have a wonderful evening and a wonderful week. I want to thank you for your continued support of the center and of the network. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Please be kind to each other. And thank you so very, very much for listening. We'll be together again first of the week. Thank you.